The judge said, "We can't proceed until the child is seated." The words landed flat and loud at the same time, and then nothing moved, not the bailiff with his hand hovering near the bench rail, not the clerk with her pen paused above the docket, not my ex-husband who kept his shoulders square and his eyes fixed on the seal behind the judge, as if it were a photograph he could memorize and hide inside later. My son stood between the two counsel tables with his sneakers planted on the polished floor, toes pointed toward me, fingers curled tight around the back of the chair behind my knees, and I could feel the pressure of his grip through the thin fabric of my skirt, each squeeze a small pulse that said, "Stay, stay, stay." The courtroom had its usual objects, the wooden pews with their carved ends, the microphones angled like listening ears, the American flag drooping slightly from a tired pole, but they felt heavier now, like they had decided to watch us, and the silence stretched the way silence does, when a room full of adults realizes a child has changed the rules without saying a word. The bailiff cleared his throat once and stopped. The sound cut short as if he'd been reminded he wasn't supposed to help, and the judge's gaze shifted from the bench to my son and back to the seating chart taped discreetly to the rail, the one that assumed a boy would do what he was told. I didn't turn around because I had been told not to make eye contact, not to cue him, not to move, the coaching allegation hanging over me like a coat I wasn't allowed to take off, but my hand slid an inch on my lap and stilled, the heel of my shoe pressing into the carpet to keep from pivoting. My ex's attorney leaned in, whispering fast, the corner of his mouth pulled tight, a man used to motion and momentum, and when he straightened, he asked for a recess, his voice practiced, controlled, the kind that pretends calm is the same as certainty, and the judge held up a finger without looking at him, a small gesture that said, "Wait," and the wait continued. My son didn't cry, didn't speak, didn't look around for permission. He stared at the floor just beyond my feet, where a scratch in the wood made a crooked line, and he traced that line with his eyes like it was a map he could follow out of here if he needed to. The clerk's computer chimed softly with an incoming calendar alert and then went quiet. Someone in the gallery shifted and stopped, and I counted breaths because that was something I could do without being accused of influence. In through my nose, out through my mouth, slow enough to keep my shoulders from rising. When the judge spoke again, it was to repeat the instruction, slower this time, and my son's fingers tightened once more on the chair behind me, the metal leg scraping a fraction of an inch before he corrected it, the sound small but sharp in the stillness, and I felt the scrape like a line drawn. The bailiff took one step forward and froze, the unspoken rule about touching children in court hanging there with us, and my ex finally moved his head, not toward his son but toward the attorney, a flick that asked, "What now?" And the attorney shook his head almost imperceptibly, a refusal of a different kind. I thought about the mornings that had led here, the way backpacks get heavier when kids don't want to leave, the way a car door closes too softly when someone is trying not to make a decision loud. But I pushed those thoughts down because this room didn't want stories. It wanted compliance, and the only compliance happening was my stillness. The judge sighed, a human sound that made the room remember he was there, and said we would take a recess until the seating issue was resolved. And the word resolved landed wrong, because nothing about this felt like it wanted to resolve. It wanted to stand. The gavel didn't strike. It didn't need to. The clerk announced the recess, chairs scraped as people stood, and then stopped again when they realized the boy was still there. The bailiff gestured to clear the well and then lowered his hand, and my ex rose halfway and sat back down, a man caught between appearances. I stayed seated because that was where I had been placed, because moving would be a statement, because the coaching claim had taught me that even a glance could be misread, and my son stayed where he was, a small body making a large problem by refusing a simple thing. When the judge stepped down from the bench and disappeared through the door behind it, the absence felt louder than his presence had, and my ex's attorney finally exhaled, the sound sharp, and said quietly that we should talk, not to me but to the bailiff, to the clerk, to anyone who might make this moment end, and no one did. The gallery murmured and then quieted when the bailiff raised his palm, and my son shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the rubber sole squeaking once before he stilled it, and that sound felt like a confession no one had asked for. I could feel heat creeping up my neck, not shame but awareness, the kind that tells you you're being watched and measured, and I kept my eyes on the edge of the counsel table, where a coffee ring had dried into a pale circle, a mark left by someone who thought they had time. When the judge returned, he didn't sit right away. He stood behind the bench and looked at my son again, longer this time, and then at the attorneys, and said we would address the refusal on the record after the recess. And the phrase on the record made the room shift because it promised permanence. And my ex's attorney nodded too quickly, and my ex didn't nod at all. The bailiff finally approached my son, not to touch him but to speak softly, and my son leaned closer to me instead, his shoulder brushing my knee, a small movement with a clear direction, and the bailiff stepped back, palms open, as if to show he had tried. The judge said we would reconvene in 15 minutes and turned away, and that was the first real movement the room allowed. People standing, papers shuffling, doors opening, and still my son didn't sit, and still I didn't turn. And still the chair behind me bore the marks of his fingers, and as the room began to empty, my ex's attorney said, too loud for a whisper, that this wasn't appropriate, and my ex said nothing. And the silence between those words and the closed door behind the judge felt like something we would all have to answer for when we came back. The recess didn't feel like a break, so much as a holding pattern, the kind where everyone pretends time is neutral when it isn't. And the first thing that changed was the rule about distance, the bailiff stepping in front of us with a polite firmness and saying we'd need to wait in separate areas, his hand indicating the hallway to my right and the benches to my left. And I nodded, because nodding had become my safest motion, while my son shifted with me, his hand still finding the back of my chair even as I stood, the metal leg making a small complaint against the floor that the bailiff noticed and corrected by lifting the chair himself. Removing the object without touching the child, a choreography everyone in that room seemed trained for. My ex's attorney immediately asked to speak with the judge, then corrected himself and asked the clerk, then corrected himself again and asked the bailiff, the request bouncing because no one had the authority he wanted during a recess, and my ex finally stood all the way up, smoothing his jacket, his eyes scanning the room for witnesses, for allies, for someone to confirm this wasn't happening, and when he saw me, he looked away as if contact itself could be construed as evidence. The clerk rolled her chair back from the desk and started typing, the soft tapping a reminder that even pauses get recorded. And the bailiff told my son gently that he needed to come with me to the hallway, that we could talk there. And my son didn't answer. He just followed when I moved, his sneakers squeaking once on the polished floor before finding the carpet near the door, a change in texture that slowed him like a warning. Outside the courtroom, the air felt thinner, the fluorescent lights harsher, and the hallway held its usual clutter of clipboards, water fountains, a bench with a tear in the vinyl, objects that suggested waiting as a lifestyle, and the bailiff stood between us and the door, not blocking but present, his radio crackling once before he turned it down, and he asked my son if he wanted water, holding out a paper cup as a neutral offering. My son shook his head, eyes on the floor, and leaned closer to me, his shoulder pressing into my side, and I kept my hands visible, fingers laced in front of me like a diagram of compliance, aware of the camera mounted above the exit sign, aware of the allegation that said I had taught him this, that every choice he made was a puppet string traced back to my wrist. My attorney arrived then, breathless, a folder tucked under her arm with the corners bent from use, and she didn't greet me with words, just a look and a nod, a silent acknowledgement that something had shifted, and she asked the bailiff, politely, if we could have a moment, and he stepped back half a pace, enough to grant space without granting privacy, and said we could talk but we couldn't discuss testimony with the child present, his eyes flicking to my son and back to us, a boundary drawn with training. My attorney lowered her voice anyway, saying the judge would want to know why the seating directive wasn't followed, that we needed to be careful, that the coaching claim was still live, and I listened without reacting, the hallway noise filling the gaps, footsteps, a copier starting up somewhere, a door opening and closing down the corridor, ordinary sounds that made this feel less like a crisis and more like a process, which was somehow worse. Inside the courtroom, through the heavy door, voices rose and fell. My ex's attorney arguing procedure, my attorney answering with restraint, and when the door opened briefly to let the clerk pass with a stack of files, I caught a glimpse of my ex pacing near the counsel table, his phone in his hand, the screen lighting his face as he typed, a habit he'd never broken, even when told not to, and the clerk took the files to a cart and rolled them away, the wheels rattling softly, evidence of other cases waiting their turn. The bailiff checked his watch and said we had about 10 minutes, and my attorney asked if my son could sit anywhere, even on the bench, to rest. And the bailiff hesitated, weighing rules against reality, and then said he could sit next to me, not next to either counsel table, and my son lowered himself onto the bench with a carefulness that felt deliberate, his knees drawn in, his backpack at his feet like a shield, and I felt the pull to smooth his hair, to say something reassuring, and resisted both, my hands staying folded, my mouth staying closed, my role reduced to presence. My ex emerged then, his attorney trailing him, and the hallway tightened, everyone adjusting their positions without being told, the bailiff stepping closer to us, my attorney angling her body between me and my ex stopped a few feet away, far enough to be polite, close enough to be seen, and said my son's name once, not loud, not soft, a test, and my son didn't look up, his fingers worrying the zipper pull on his backpack, the metal making a faint click as it slid and stopped, and my ex's face changed, a flicker of irritation he smoothed over quickly, and he looked at me instead, his eyes asking a question he didn't speak. My attorney answered it by saying now wasn't appropriate, that the judge would address it on the record, and my ex's attorney added that this was irregular, that children refuse seats all the time, that it didn't mean anything. Words piling up to cover the space, and the bailiff cleared his throat, a reminder of where we were, and suggested we return to the courtroom when called. The clerk appeared in the doorway then and said we were back on in 2 minutes, her voice neutral, efficient, and the hallway rearranged itself again, people moving to their places, the bailiff opening the door and holding it, the American flag visible just inside, and my son stood when I stood, his shoulder brushing my arm, and we walked back in together, the carpet giving way to wood, the room settling into its shape as if nothing had happened, as if a boy hadn't refused a simple instruction and forced a pause that everyone would now pretend was procedural. The judge was already seated, his glasses on the bench in front of him, a legal pad open, and he looked up as we entered, his eyes moving from my son to me, to the empty chair beside my ex, and he didn't speak right away, letting the silence do the work, and my ex sat, smoothing his jacket again, and my son stopped where he had before, his hand reaching for the back of my chair, and the judge said my son could sit next to me for the remainder of the hearing, his voice measured, and the room exhaled, as if that solved something, and my son sat, finally, the bench creaking under his weight, and I felt the shift like a door closing quietly, not an end but a narrowing, and the judge looked at the attorneys and said he would want an explanation for the refusal, that it would be addressed, that allegations had been made and would be examined, and my ex's attorney nodded, and the clerk typed, and I stared at the coffee ring on the table again, thinking about how marks get left behind even when no one intends them, and how this one would follow us into whatever came next. The days after the hearing settled into a routine that looked ordinary from the outside and felt like pressure from the inside, the kind that doesn't bruise but leaves you sore all the same. And it started the next morning in the school parking lot, where engines idled and doors slammed and parents checked phones while pretending not to watch each other. And my son sat in the passenger seat with his backpack already on, straps tight across his shoulders like he might need to leave quickly, his gaze fixed on the windshield as if the building ahead were something to get through rather than go into. I pulled into our usual spot, the crack in the asphalt still there like a marker, and turned off the engine, the silence inside the car sharp after the radio cut, and I waited because waiting had become our language. And when I glanced at him, he nodded once and reached for the door handle himself, the small click loud in the stillness, and he stepped out without looking back, his sneakers scuffing the curb as he went. And I watched him walk toward the entrance where a teacher held the door open, a daily kindness that now felt like a checkpoint. At work, I missed my morning meeting because my attorney called, her name lighting up my phone while I was pouring coffee from the break room pot that always tasted burnt, and I stepped into the hallway, pressing my back to the cool wall beneath a framed mission statement I'd stopped reading years ago, and she told me the coaching allegation had been reiterated in a filing, that the refusal to sit had been characterized as rehearsed, that a child custody evaluation was being scheduled to assess influence and alignment, her words careful and clipped, and I nodded even though she couldn't see me, the phone warm against my ear, my free hand gripping the paper cup hard enough to crease it. When I hung up, I threw the coffee away without drinking it and went back to my desk, answering emails, attending calls, keeping my voice even, the mouse clicking under my palm like a metronome, and no one there knew that my parenting had become a question to be answered by strangers with forms and checklists. The first supervised exchange happened that afternoon at a community center with a peeling sign and a security desk staffed by a man who asked for IDs with practiced neutrality. And my son stood beside me while I signed in, his backpack at his feet again, his fingers tracing the seam along the strap, and the supervisor led us to a room with plastic chairs arranged in a semicircle, a box of tissues on a low table, and a clock that ticked too loudly, each second a reminder that time here belonged to someone else. My ex arrived late, his shoes squeaking on the linoleum, his smile quick and thin, and he greeted the supervisor first, then my son, using the same tone for both, and my son didn't answer, his eyes on the floor, and the supervisor made a note on her clipboard, the pen scratching once before stopping, and said we would begin. And I stepped back because that was the rule, because proximity was now suspect. The visit unfolded in fragments, my ex talking, my son nodding occasionally, the supervisor watching, the clock ticking, and when it ended my son came back to me without being prompted, his hand finding my sleeve, and the supervisor noted that too, her face unreadable, and I signed out again, my name looping across the page like it always had, as if consistency could count for something. At home that night I laid out dinner, plates on the table, forks aligned, the small domestic order a comfort I didn't admit out loud, and my son ate quietly, pushing peas to one side, chewing slowly, and when I asked about school he shrugged, the motion minimal, and I let it go, washing dishes afterward while he did homework at the counter, the sound of the faucet steady, the smell of soap sharp, and when he finished, he slid the paper toward me for a signature. A permission slip for a field trip, the date circled in red, and I signed it, my pen hesitating for a second before making the mark, aware that even this could be interpreted if someone wanted it to be. The evaluation notice arrived 2 days later by email and by mail, redundancy that felt deliberate, and the envelope sat on the kitchen table until I opened it with a butter knife, the paper inside crisp and official, outlining appointments, expectations, observations. And I read it twice, then folded it back into thirds and placed it under a magnet on the fridge. The hum of the appliance, a constant presence, and my son watched me from the doorway, his posture tense, and I said only that we had some meetings coming up, my voice steady, and he nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor, and went to his room, the door clicking shut with a care that felt learned. The next morning the school counselor called, her number unfamiliar, and asked if my son had been stressed lately, if anything had changed at home, her questions gentle but pointed, and I answered with facts, schedules, routines, the way we always did homework after snack, the way bedtime stayed the same, and she thanked me and said she would document the conversation, the word document hanging there, and after we hung up I sat at the table and stared at the magnet holding the evaluation notice, the way it kept the paper flat and visible, a reminder that pressure doesn't always push, sometimes it just sits. At the second supervised exchange my ex brought a small toy, plastic and loud, and the supervisor hesitated before allowing it, noting it on her clipboard, and my son accepted it without enthusiasm, setting it on the table rather than playing, and when the visit ended, he left it behind, the toy abandoned like an offering no one wanted, and the supervisor picked it up and put it in a lost and found bin, another note made. My attorney called that evening to say the evaluator had requested records, school attendance, medical notes, calendars, that access logs from the community center would be reviewed, and I opened my planner on the kitchen counter, flipping pages, the dates already filled with work deadlines and grocery reminders and soccer practice crossed out for the season, and I realized how much of my life was already written down, waiting to be interpreted. On Friday afternoon, my son climbed into the car slower than usual, his backpack heavier with the weekend's books, and when I asked if he was okay, he said he was tired, his voice flat, and I nodded and pulled out of the lot, the radio low, the road familiar, and at a stoplight I glanced at him and saw his fingers tracing the same zipper pull. Back and forth, a small repetition, and I kept my eyes on the light until it turned green, aware that the week ahead would bring more appointments, more rooms with clocks, more notes taken by people trained to see patterns, and that somewhere in those patterns the truth would either hold or slip, and there would be no way to explain it afterward. The evaluator's office sat in a low brick building tucked behind a strip mall, the kind of place designed to be neutral, and the waiting room smelled faintly of disinfectant and old magazines, the chairs arranged in careful angles that suggested choice without offering comfort, and my son sat beside me, with his backpack between his feet, the zipper pull looped around his finger like an anchor, and I sat with my hands folded again, the habit now automatic, while a receptionist slid forms across the counter, her acrylic nails tapping as she pointed to signature lines without meeting my eyes. The intake paperwork asked questions that looked simple until you tried to answer them. Checkboxes about routines, discipline, communication, and I filled them out with the pen provided, the ink flowing smoothly, aware of how each mark might be weighed later, and when my son's name was called, he stood without looking at me and followed the evaluator down the hallway, the door closing softly behind them, leaving me with the hum of a soda machine and a television mounted too high on the wall playing a morning show with the sound off. Time stretched there, measured by the page turns of an outdated magazine and the slow movement of a second hand on the wall clock, and when the door finally opened, my son emerged first, his face blank in the way it gets when he's processing something bigger than he wants to say, and the evaluator followed, a woman with a calm posture and a clipboard held close, and she thanked us both and said she would be in touch. Her voice even, practiced, and we left without lingering, the glass door swinging shut behind us with a soft thud that felt like punctuation. Over the next week, the requests multiplied. Emails asking for calendars, attendance records, medical appointment summaries, and I spent evenings at the kitchen table with my laptop open and my planner spread beside it, cross-referencing dates, uploading PDFs, naming files carefully, the cursor blinking while I considered each attachment, and my son did his homework across from me, erasing and rewriting answers, his pencil wearing down faster than usual, and when he finished, he stacked his books neatly and waited, the waiting again, until I nodded that it was time for bed. One afternoon, my attorney forwarded me a copy of the therapist's intake notes, sections redacted, and I read the remaining lines slowly. The language, clinical, observations about nonverbal behavior, about hesitation, about alignment, and one sentence stood out, a neutral note that my son displayed consistent avoidance of proximity to his father without prompting, and I read it twice, my finger tracing the line on the screen, and then I closed the document without replying, aware that even relief could be misinterpreted if expressed too quickly. The next supervised exchange took place at the same community center, the clock still loud, the supervisor the same. But this time there was an additional observer seated against the wall, a woman with a badge clipped to her belt who introduced herself as part of the evaluation process, and she watched quietly, her pen moving in short strokes, and my ex talked more than usual, filling the space with questions and jokes that landed flat, and my son responded minimally, nods and shrugs, his hands folded in his lap, and when the hour ended he stood immediately, the chair legs scraping just enough to draw attention, and walked back to me without hesitation, the observer noting something I couldn't see. At home that night, I found my son sitting on his bed with his backpack open, rearranging its contents, moving items from one pocket to another and back again, and I sat in the doorway without entering, the frame a boundary I respected, and asked if he needed help, and he shook his head, continuing the task until it seemed right to him, and then he zipped the bag closed with a decisive pull and set it by the door, ready for morning. The evaluator called later that week to schedule a follow-up, her voice calm, her calendar full, and she asked if there had been any changes since the last visit, and I answered with facts again, school, work, exchanges, nothing else, and she thanked me and said she would also be requesting access logs from the community center to corroborate timelines, and after we hung up, I opened my email and searched for the sign-in confirmations, the timestamps lining up like small witnesses, and I forwarded them without comment. On Friday, my ex's attorney sent a notice disputing the interpretation of my son's behavior, asserting again that refusal equaled coaching, that proximity preferences could be influenced, and my attorney replied with restraint, attaching documentation, and copied me, and I read the exchange without responding, the screen glowing on the counter while I stirred a pot on the stove, the smell of onions filling the kitchen. Ordinary life continuing alongside arguments about my child's inner world. That weekend, the evaluator came to our home, her shoes left neatly by the door, her notebook in hand as she sat at the table where we ate most meals, and she asked my son to show her his room, and he did, pointing out his desk, his shelves, the poster taped crookedly above his bed, and she asked him questions while I stayed in the kitchen, the clink of dishes, a background sound, careful not to hover, and when they returned, she asked me about routines, about mornings, about evenings, and I answered while wiping the counter. My movement steady, the cloth circling a small stain until it disappeared. After she left, my son sat at the table and drank a glass of water in long pulls, the glass emptying quickly, and he set it down with a small thud and said he was tired. And I nodded and told him he could rest, and he went to his room, the door closing with that same careful click, and I stood there a moment longer, listening to the house settle, aware that somewhere notes were being compiled, patterns compared, narratives weighed against behavior, and that the simple fact of a child choosing where to sit had opened a series of quiet examinations that would soon have to land somewhere, whether anyone liked the outcome or not. By the time the next hearing date was set, my calendar looked like a losing game of Tetris, blocks stacked without room to rotate, work meetings bumped for evaluations, evaluations bumped for supervised exchanges, and the margins where rest used to live, erased entirely. And the strain showed up first in small places, the gaslight flicking on earlier than expected, the checking account balance forcing me to pause before ordering groceries, the email from HR reminding me of accrued leave as if time off were a gift instead of a cost. I started keeping receipts in a folder on the counter, sliding them under the flap without sorting, a quiet record of fuel, parking meters, copy fees, and every time I added another slip, I felt the folder gain weight, the paper a physical measure of how narrow our options were becoming. My attorney called one morning while I was in the car outside my office, the engine still running, the steering wheel warm under my hands, and told me the evaluator had requested additional collateral, school attendance logs beyond the last year, a statement from the exchange supervisor, confirmation of who paid for which services, her tone apologetic but firm, and I wrote it all down on a sticky note I pressed to the dashboard, the adhesive failing in the heat and curling at the edges. When I got to my desk, I opened a new spreadsheet and started listing costs and dates, the columns filling quickly, and when my manager stopped by to ask if I could take on an extra project, I said I needed to check my capacity, the phrase sounding professional and hollow, and she nodded and said to let her know, her eyes flicking briefly to the stack of folders I hadn't had time to file. The next supervised exchange was rescheduled twice because of staffing issues, each change requiring coordination, more emails, more hours off, and when it finally happened, the observer returned with a different badge clipped to her belt. The rotation itself, another variable, and my ex arrived early this time, sitting stiffly in the plastic chair, his phone face down on the table, a deliberate choice, and my son entered and stopped short, assessing the room, then took his seat closest to the exit, the chair legs scraping loudly enough that the supervisor glanced up, and my ex said nothing, his jaw tight, and the observer wrote something down immediately. Afterward, in the parking lot, my son climbed into the car and asked if we could go home instead of stopping for groceries like usual, his voice flat, and I said yes without asking why, the routine bending again. And at home we ate leftovers standing at the counter, plates balanced in one hand, forks in the other, neither of us sitting, as if sitting itself had become a choice that carried too much meaning. The evaluator's follow-up appointment took place over video, my laptop propped on a stack of cookbooks to get the angle right, the camera showing just enough of the kitchen to appear normal, and she asked questions about finances, about support, about stress, and I answered honestly, without elaborating, my gaze steady on the lens, aware that even a sigh could be interpreted, and when she asked about the allegation directly, about whether I had discussed seating with my son, I said no, one word, clean, and let the silence after it sit until she nodded and moved on. Later that afternoon, my attorney forwarded me a subpoena notice, a witness identified from the community center, and the words, "new witness" sat heavy on the screen. And she called to explain that it could cut both ways, that testimony might help clarify patterns, but that it also meant another person interpreting us aloud, another voice entering the record. And when I hung up, I closed my laptop and stood at the counter staring at the receipt folder. The flap bowed outward, and I slid it into a drawer to get it out of sight, an avoidance that felt temporary at best. Work became less forgiving as deadlines approached, my inbox filling faster than I could clear it. And when I missed a call from my manager, she followed up with a calendar invite labeled check-in. And I accepted it, the time slot cutting into an evaluation prep session, and I rearranged again, the day bending around demands that didn't care why. The check-in was brief and polite, questions about bandwidth, about deliverables, and I answered with specifics, offering solutions, and she listened and said she appreciated my transparency. The word landing, strangely, given how much of my life felt like it was being examined under a lamp. And after the call, I closed the door to my office and leaned back in my chair for a moment longer than usual, the hum of the building loud in the quiet. At home that night, my son asked if he had to go to the next exchange, his eyes on his plate, his voice careful, and I told him yes, that we had to follow the schedule. My tone steady, and he nodded and took another bite, chewing slowly, and when he finished, he carried his plate to the sink without being asked, the routine intact even as the edges frayed. The next morning, the bank app sent an alert about a low balance, a neutral notification that felt accusatory, and I transferred funds from savings, watching the numbers update, and made a note to review expenses later, the later that never quite arrived. My attorney called again that afternoon with a warning, her voice lower, saying the other side was doubling down, that they intended to argue influence more aggressively now that timelines were being scrutinized, that we needed to be prepared for pushback at the next public hearing. And I listened while folding laundry on the couch, pairing socks, smoothing shirts, the domestic motions grounding me even as the stakes tightened. When I hung up, I stacked the folded clothes neatly and carried them to my son's room, placing them in his dresser, the wood drawer sliding closed with a soft thud, and I stood there a moment, looking at the space, aware that every choice was narrowing, that the room for error was shrinking, and that the next hearing would not allow for quiet adjustments, that whatever had been building through routines, records, and restrained answers was about to be tested in a room where witnesses watched and consequences landed, whether anyone was ready or not. The no-denial zone arrived quietly, not with a bang but with emails that stopped asking and started stating, the evaluator copying both attorneys on a message that confirmed receipt of access logs from the community center, school attendance records, and supervisor statements. And when I read the line about corroboration, my stomach tightened, not from fear but from the knowledge that once facts line up, they don't care who's comfortable. The logs showed times and dates in plain columns, check-in at 4:02, check-out at 5:1, notes about arrival demeanor, departure demeanor, and I opened them on my laptop at the kitchen counter while stirring soup, the steam fogging the screen for a moment before I wiped it away with my sleeve, the mundane act grounding me as the pattern became visible even to my untrained eye. My attorney called to say the other side was challenging the interpretation, not the data, a pivot that sounded strategic and thin, and she advised me to keep doing exactly what I'd been doing, nothing more, nothing less. The safest place now, the center, and I nodded into the phone, the ladle resting against the pot, a small clink marking the end of the call. The evaluator requested one more observation at the exchange, this time with a specific focus on transitions, and the supervisor acknowledged the request with a brief reply that included a calendar invite, the subject line, neutral. And when the day came, the room felt smaller, the clock louder, the chairs closer together, and my son chose the seat nearest the door again without looking at anyone, his backpack on his lap like a shield, and the evaluator sat off to the side, hands folded, watching the space between people more than the people themselves. My ex arrived late again, offered an apology that hung in the air without landing, and tried to make conversation about school, about weather, about anything that might soften the edges, and my son responded with one-word answers when he responded at all, his eyes flicking to the exit more than to his father, and the evaluator's pen moved steadily, not hurried, not dramatic, just consistent. And when the hour ended, my son stood before anyone spoke, the chair scraping louder than before, and walked straight to me, stopping close enough that his shoulder brushed my arm, a proximity choice made without instruction. And the evaluator glanced up then, the smallest lift of her chin, and wrote something longer than before. In the parking lot, my ex's attorney approached, careful to keep distance, and said we needed to discuss timelines, that there were discrepancies in recollections that needed clarification, his tone professional, and my attorney stepped in smoothly, saying all communications should go through counsel, and he nodded and stepped back, the exchange brief and contained, and my son climbed into the car, buckled himself, and stared out the window while I started the engine, the vibration traveling up through the seat, a reminder that motion still existed. The evaluator's report draft arrived as a notice of availability rather than a document, access restricted pending review, and my attorney scheduled a time to go over it together, and when we met in her office, she slid a printed summary across the table, her finger resting on a paragraph that described non-verbal avoidance patterns across settings, consistency over time, lack of evidence supporting coaching, the language careful and precise, and I read it once, then again, my eyes catching on the word consistent, the relief there tempered by the awareness that nothing was final yet. She warned me that the other side would push back hard now, that the claim would shift from coaching to confusion or stress, that the hearing would be public, that witnesses would be present, and that the judge would expect clear answers. And I nodded, my hands folded again, the habit, a comfort, and asked what I needed to do, and she said to keep doing nothing extra, to answer when asked, to let the record speak, a phrase that sounded abstract until you realized it meant letting strangers narrate your life aloud. At home that evening, I organized the receipt folder for the first time, spreading slips across the table, sorting by date, the paper making a soft shuffling sound, and I noticed how often parking fees repeated, how many copies I'd paid for, how the costs clustered around exchange days, and I stacked them neatly and slid them back into the folder, the weight unchanged but now ordered. My son sat nearby working on a puzzle, pieces clicking into place, his focus intense, and when he finished, he slid the completed picture toward me without comment, a small offering, and I nodded and slid it back to him, letting him keep it intact. The night before the hearing, I laid out clothes for both of us, neutral colors, comfortable shoes, nothing that drew attention, and I set my alarm earlier than usual. The phone face down on the nightstand, and when I turned off the light, the room felt quiet in a way that wasn't empty, my mind running through logistics rather than arguments, where to park, which entrance to use, who would be there. In the morning, the courthouse steps were crowded, the sound of footsteps and voices echoing off stone, and we moved through security, belts in bins, pockets emptied, the metal detector humming as we passed, and inside the hallway buzzed with low conversation, attorneys conferring, families waiting, and I felt the shift as we entered the courtroom, the space filling, the judge's bench visible ahead, and I knew this would be the hearing where data met narrative, where the quiet accumulation of logs, notes, and observed choices would be spoken into the room, and that once spoken, they would not belong to us anymore. My attorney squeezed my arm briefly before we took our seats, a rare touch, and my son stood beside me, close, his hand hovering near the back of my chair, and when the clerk called the case and everyone rose, the chairs scraping in unison, I felt the narrowing complete, the sense that the question of influence had nowhere left to hide, that the next word spoken would push it into the open whether anyone wanted that or not. The courtroom was fuller than it had been before, the benches occupied by people who didn't know us but understood the stakes, grandparents waiting for other cases, law students with notepads, a few observers who seemed to appear whenever something contested was on the docket. And the air carried that particular mix of paper, polish, and anticipation that comes when a room expects to witness something settle. When the clerk called our case, the sound of chairs scraping rose and fell together, and my son stood beside me, his shoulder close enough that I felt the warmth through my sleeve, his hand hovering near the back of my chair without touching it yet, a habit now, and we faced the bench, while the judge adjusted his glasses and looked out over the room as if measuring it. The evaluator was seated near the front, a neutral presence with a folder on her lap, and the exchange supervisor sat 2 rows back, hands folded, eyes forward, witnesses in plain clothes that made them easy to miss if you weren't looking for them. The judge began by summarizing the issue before him, his voice steady, the words familiar now, allegations of influence, questions of credibility, the need to assess a child's behavior in context, and as he spoke, I kept my gaze on the edge of the table, the wood smooth under my fingertips when I placed my hand there to ground myself, aware of how many eyes were trained on small movements. My ex's attorney stood first, buttoning his jacket, and addressed the court with practiced confidence, framing the refusal to sit as an anomaly, a product of stress, a child caught between parents, his phrases chosen to sound compassionate while leaving room for doubt. And when he finished, he sat, folding his hands as if he had concluded something solid. My attorney rose next, unhurried, and asked permission to call the evaluator, and the judge nodded, and the evaluator took the stand, swore in, and sat, the microphone angled toward her mouth, and the room leaned in without moving. She spoke about process, about observation across settings, about consistency over time, and when asked specifically about the courtroom refusal, she described it without embellishment: a child standing, choosing proximity to one parent, avoiding the other, no prompting observed, no reinforcement, and the words landed with weight because they were simple. And simplicity carries authority in rooms like this. My ex's attorney cross-examined, his questions tight, suggesting alternative explanations, stress responses, learned behavior, and the evaluator answered calmly, referencing logs, dates, corroboration. And when he pressed about coaching, she said she had seen no evidence of it, the phrase, "no evidence," echoing slightly in the microphone, and the judge wrote something on his legal pad, the pen scratching audibly in the quiet. When the supervisor was called next, she described the exchanges, the seating choices, the transitions, her notes consistent with the logs already submitted, and when asked about who initiated proximity, she answered plainly, "The child," repeatedly, and my ex shifted in his chair, the movement small but visible, his knee bouncing once before he stilled it. The judge then addressed my son directly, not with questions but with instructions, saying he didn't need to speak, that he was not on trial, that adults were responsible for the decisions in the room, and my son nodded, his hand finally resting on the back of my chair, fingers light, and the judge turned back to the attorneys and said he would address the seating incident now, on the record, and the room tightened again. He described the moment as he had seen it, the refusal, the pause, the recess, and then he stated that based on the testimony and documentation presented, the behavior did not support the allegation of coaching. His words, careful, deliberate, and my ex's attorney objected softly, citing interpretation, and the judge raised a hand and continued, saying interpretation must follow evidence, not the other way around, and the objection fell away. The judge noted that the child's consistent avoidance of proximity had been observed in multiple settings by multiple professionals, and that while stress could influence behavior, the pattern here was specific and sustained, and the gallery was silent, the kind of silence that listens. My ex stared straight ahead, his jaw set, his attorney scribbling notes that seemed suddenly unnecessary, and I felt my chest tighten, not with victory but with the gravity of having our private dynamics spoken aloud to strangers who would carry them out of the room. The judge concluded this portion by stating that the coaching allegation was unsupported by the record as it stood, and that further arguments to that effect would need to meet a higher threshold, his words formal but clear, and he set his pen down, the sound final. He then ordered the records entered fully into evidence, naming the logs, the reports, the supervisor's statements, and the clerk marked them. The keyboard clicks, punctuating the moment, and I felt the shift as something intangible became fixed. When the judge called for a brief pause before moving on, the room exhaled in small ways, shoulders dropping, papers rustling, and my attorney leaned toward me just enough to whisper that this was important, not to celebrate, just to mark it, and I nodded once, my eyes still forward. My son stayed close, his hand on the chair steady now, and when we all stood again at the judge's signal, the chair's scraping felt different, less chaotic, more contained, as if the room itself had adjusted its understanding. As the hearing moved into procedural matters, scheduling, next steps, my ex's attorney asked for clarification on the scope of the ruling, his tone tight, and the judge responded that clarity had been provided, that the record spoke plainly, and that any further challenge would need to address facts already entered, and the attorney nodded, the fight gone from his posture for the moment. When the clerk announced the next case number and the gallery began to shift, people standing, whispering, collecting bags, I realized we were being watched in a different way now, not as a question but as a reference. And as we gathered our things, my son picked up his backpack and slung it over his shoulder, the motion confident, and we walked toward the aisle together. The evaluator's gaze following briefly, the supervisor offering a small nod, and I felt the public weight of the scene settle behind us as we stepped out, knowing that whatever came next would be shaped by what had just been said aloud, in front of witnesses who would remember the quiet more than the words. Outside the courtroom, the hallway felt narrower than before, people moving past us with lowered voices and quick glances, the kind of attention that pretends to be accidental, and my son adjusted his backpack strap as we walked, the fabric rasping softly against his jacket, and I matched his pace without thinking, the rhythm familiar now, step for step, toward the exit where the security desk hummed and the metal detector chirped for someone else. My attorney walked beside us for a few steps, murmuring about scheduling and next filings, her voice practical, and then she stopped to speak with a colleague, leaving us to continue alone, and the separation felt deliberate, like a test of how we would carry what had just happened without guidance. In the atrium, sunlight spilled across the tile, harsh after the courtroom's dimness, and my son squinted, lifting a hand to shield his eyes, and I paused long enough for him to adjust, the pause a habit we'd learned together, and when he nodded we moved on, the revolving door turning with a soft whoosh that marked the boundary between inside and out. On the steps, a small cluster of people lingered, waiting for rides or smoking, and one woman glanced at us and then looked away too quickly, recognition flickering and disappearing, and my son slowed, his shoulder brushing my arm again, and I resisted the urge to say anything, letting proximity speak for itself. In the car, the silence returned, thick but not heavy, the engine idling while I buckled in and started the navigation out of habit even though I knew the route, and my son stared out the window as we pulled away, the courthouse shrinking in the rearview mirror, its stone facade steady and impassive, and I felt the delayed release of tension in my shoulders, a small drop that made me aware of how tightly I'd been holding myself together. At the first red light, my phone buzzed on the console, a message from my attorney summarizing what had just occurred in careful terms. The words, record, threshold, next steps appearing again, and I read it without replying, the light turning green before I finished, forcing me to move on. The rest of the afternoon unfolded with the odd normalcy that follows public moments. Grocery carts squeaking in the aisles, a cashier asking if I wanted paper or plastic, my son choosing apples and inspecting them closely before placing them in the bag, and no one there knew what had been said about us hours earlier, how our private patterns had been spoken into a room and weighed, and that anonymity felt both comforting and unreal. At home, I unpacked groceries while my son did homework at the counter, the routine intact, and the refrigerator door opened and closed with its usual thump. And when I reached for the magnet to pin a new schedule update to the fridge, I noticed how crowded the space had become with papers, notices, calendars, and I removed an outdated flyer to make room, the small act of curation feeling significant. That evening, the phone rang while I was washing dishes, my hands slick with soap, and when I answered, my mother's voice filled the kitchen, cautious and relieved at the same time, and she asked how it went, and I gave her the facts without interpretation, the evaluator's testimony, the judge's statement, the record, and she exhaled audibly and said she was glad, and then asked what came next. And I said another hearing, more procedures, nothing resolved yet, and she said she was proud of me, the word hanging there, and I changed the subject to the weather, to dinner plans, anything safer. The next day at school, pick up a teacher I recognized but didn't know well approached, her smile hesitant, and said she'd seen my son doing well in class, that he seemed focused, her comment neutral but timed, and I thanked her and nodded. And my son stood beside me, his hands in his pockets, his gaze on the ground, and we walked to the car without lingering, the interaction brief but charged by context only I carried. Emails followed over the next few days, my attorney forwarding notices, my ex's attorney requesting clarification on scheduling, the evaluator requesting confirmation of availability for the next phase, and each message added to the sense of being observed, even in the quiet spaces, and I answered when required, concisely, letting the paper trail grow. At the next supervised exchange, the room felt different, the supervisor's tone more formal, the observer absent this time, replaced by the weight of what had already been documented, and my ex arrived on time, sat down, and said very little, his phone face down again, and my son chose his seat near the door as always. The pattern now established, and the hour passed with fewer words than before, the clock ticking loud in the reduced chatter, and when it ended, my son stood and left without hesitation, the chair scraping softly, and the supervisor watched him go with a thoughtful expression before turning to make her notes. In the parking lot, my ex's attorney approached again, this time with a different energy, asking about logistics, about future exchanges, about making things smoother for everyone, and my attorney responded politely, agreeing to discuss scheduling, the shift subtle but clear, and as they spoke, my son climbed into the car and buckled himself, his movements efficient, and I realized he was listening without appearing to, his awareness tuned to changes in tone. That night, my son asked if the judge had been mad, his question simple, and I said no. That the judge's job was to listen and decide, and he nodded and went back to his drawing, the pencil moving in confident strokes, and I watched from the doorway, aware that social pressure doesn't always shout, sometimes it just rearranges the room until everyone knows where to stand. Over the weekend, a neighbor stopped me while I was taking out the trash, her voice lowered, asking if everything was okay, that she'd seen the car gone a lot, and I said we were busy, which was true, and she nodded and said she was around if I needed anything. The offer kind and awkward, and I thanked her and wheeled the bin back to the garage, the lid clattering as it closed. As the days passed, the public nature of what had happened settled into quieter forms, glances, softened questions, a slight shift in how professionals addressed us, and I felt the pressure not as an attack but as a steady awareness, the knowledge that the story was now larger than us, carried in records and recollections beyond our control, and that the next phase would test not just what had been said, but how it would be acted on. And as I set my alarm for the coming week and turned off the light, my son already asleep in his room, I understood that the space between exposure and consequence can be its own kind of waiting, one that asks you to keep living normally while the ground rearranges itself underneath. The consolidation didn't announce itself as a turning point. It arrived as a series of small confirmations that began to stack, the kind you don't notice until the pile changes how the table looks, and it started with an email from my attorney, labeled Summary Review, the subject line bland, the content precise, listing what had now been formally entered and what would be addressed next, and I read it standing at the kitchen counter while my son ate cereal, the spoon clinking against the bowl in a steady rhythm that made the legal language feel almost unreal. The evaluator's full report was now part of the record, she wrote, along with the access logs, the supervisor's testimony, the school attendance confirmations, and the home observation notes, and when I scrolled through the attachments later that morning, I saw how the pieces fit together, without commentary, timestamps aligning, descriptions repeating without copying, the same behaviors observed by people who had never spoken to each other outside formal channels, and that alignment carried a weight that didn't need interpretation. At work, my calendar pinged with reminders I ignored for an hour longer than usual, the report open on my screen, my cursor hovering over sentences I read again and again, not searching for praise but for gaps, for anything that could be twisted, and finding fewer than I'd feared, a relief that settled slowly, like a muscle finally unclenching. My attorney called to walk me through it, her voice steady, pointing out how the narrative now relied less on assertion and more on accumulation, that the claim of coaching had been replaced in the other side's filings with language about stress and confusion, a retreat that signaled pressure even if it wasn't an admission. And she said this mattered, that judges notice when arguments shift under scrutiny, and I nodded, my pen tapping lightly against the counter as I took notes I might never need. The next exchange came and went without incident, the supervisor greeting us by name, the room unchanged, the clock still loud, and my son took his usual seat near the door, the habit now normalized, and my ex arrived and stayed quiet, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on the table, and when the hour ended, my son left promptly, no hesitation, the sequence predictable enough that the supervisor didn't need to look up to note it, and that predictability felt like proof in its own right. In the parking lot, my attorney met us, an unscheduled appearance that caught my attention, and she said she'd just spoken with the clerk, that the judge had reviewed the consolidated materials ahead of the next hearing, an unusual step that suggested engagement, and she cautioned me not to read too much into it while clearly reading something into it herself, and we parted with a nod, the conversation brief but charged. At home, I printed a copy of the consolidated index and slid it into the receipt folder, the paper fitting neatly now that I'd organized it, the folder no longer just a record of expense but a timeline of effort, and my son watched me do it from the doorway, his expression neutral, and then asked if we could go to the park, a request that felt like a test of whether life could still expand outward, and I said yes, grabbing keys, the decision immediate. At the park, he ran ahead, his movements freer than they'd been in weeks, and I sat on a bench watching him climb and jump, the sounds of other children filling the air, and for a moment the pressure eased, replaced by the simple fact of a child at play. And when he came back to me breathless and smiling, He asked if the next hearing would be soon, and I said yes, that it would. And he nodded, as if he'd expected that answer, his acceptance quiet. The days leading up to the hearing were filled with preparation that looked like waiting, my attorney reviewing potential questions, advising me on brevity, reminding me that I wasn't there to persuade but to respond, and I practiced answering aloud in the car, my voice calm, my words factual, stopping when explanations crept in, training myself to let silence stand where it needed to. My ex's attorney sent a proposed stipulation that softened language around influence, reframing it as concern rather than accusation, and my attorney forwarded it with a note that said, "This is movement," and I read it carefully. The concession, small but telling, and agreed to the language, not because it felt satisfying, but because it narrowed the field. On the morning of the hearing, the courthouse felt familiar now, security routine, the hallway sounds known, and as we entered the courtroom, I noticed how the seating had shifted subtly. The evaluator again present, the supervisor there, fewer observers this time, but more intention in the room. And my son stood beside me, his hand hovering near the chair back, the gesture unchanged, and when the clerk called the case and we rose, the moment felt less chaotic than before, more contained, as if the room understood what it was about to hear. Before proceedings began, the judge addressed counsel, referencing the materials submitted, noting their consistency, and asking pointed questions about what remained disputed, and my ex's attorney responded cautiously, acknowledging the documentation while attempting to preserve room for argument, and the judge listened without interruption, his pen still, and then turned to my attorney and asked for clarification on timelines, and she provided it succinctly, the dates falling into place like beads on a string. As the discussion unfolded, it became clear that what was left was not whether the behavior had occurred, but what should be done with that knowledge. And that distinction shifted the energy in the room, less defensive, more procedural, and I felt my shoulders drop a fraction. The understanding settling that the fight over truth was giving way to a negotiation over consequence. When the judge announced that he would be taking the matter under advisement and issuing a ruling at the next session, the phrase landed with weight, a pause that promised direction, and he scheduled the date, his clerk typing it in, the sound crisp, and I wrote it down in my planner, the square finally filled. As we gathered our things, my ex avoided my gaze, his movements efficient, his attorney already speaking to him in low tones, and my son slipped his backpack over his shoulder and stood close to me, the proximity now a quiet constant. And as we walked out of the courtroom, I felt the consolidation complete. Not as a triumph, but as a foundation laid, solid enough to hold whatever decision came next, and I understood that the story was no longer about proving something had happened. It was about what the court would now be forced to do with what it could no longer deny. The second public scene unfolded with less spectacle and more weight, the kind that presses down rather than bursts, and when we entered the courtroom that morning, the clerk was already arranging exhibits on a side table, manila folders stacked in a careful order, each labeled with black marker that made their contents feel final before anyone spoke. The judge took the bench without delay, glasses already on, legal pad open, and the room settled faster than it had before, the rustle of coats and bags giving way to stillness as if everyone understood this was not a day for posturing. My son stood beside me, as he always did now, his backpack at his feet, his hand hovering near the back of my chair before resting there lightly, a familiar point of contact, and when the clerk called the case and we rose, the movement felt rehearsed, the difference between chaos and routine. My ex's attorney stood first, acknowledging the consolidated record, his tone careful, and framed his remarks around concern rather than accusation, the shift my attorney had warned me about. And as he spoke, he gestured once toward the folders on the table, as if to say the documents were heavy, but not decisive. My attorney responded by asking permission to address the court with the compiled evidence, and the judge nodded, motioning toward the exhibits, and the clerk handed her the first folder, the paper sliding against paper with a sound that carried farther than expected. She didn't dramatize it. She simply walked through the sequence. Dates and times aligned across access logs, supervisor notes, evaluator observations, and school records, each piece reinforcing the last. And when she referenced the courtroom seating incident, she did so briefly, placing it in context rather than at the center. The behavior one data point among many. The judge listened without interruption, his pen moving steadily, and when my attorney finished, he asked a direct question, whether any evidence in the record contradicted the pattern described, and my ex's attorney paused, shuffled his notes, and said no. Not contradicted, but open to interpretation, and the judge leaned back slightly, the chair creaking once, and said interpretation must still rest on what exists, not on what is wished for, and the room absorbed the correction quietly. The clerk was instructed to read specific entries into the record, timestamps and observations spoken aloud, the neutral voice giving them permanence, and as she read, the supervisor sat with her hands folded, the evaluator with her folder closed, their earlier words now detached from them and belonging to the court. My ex shifted in his seat, crossed and uncrossed his legs, then stilled, his attorney placing a hand flat on the table as if to anchor the moment, and I felt my own breathing slow as the evidence did what it was meant to do without anyone insisting that it mattered. The judge then asked my attorney about remedies, the word precise, and she spoke about safety, about clarity, about the need for conditions that matched the reality already observed, and she did not look at my ex when she said it, addressing the bench instead, and the judge nodded, writing again. When my ex's attorney responded, he focused on process, on future cooperation, on minimizing disruption, his language careful to avoid denial. And when he finished, the judge sat back, hands resting on the bench, and summarized what he had heard, his words measured, acknowledging the shift in arguments, the weight of corroboration, and the responsibility of the court to respond appropriately. He stated plainly that the strongest evidence now before him did not support the prior claim of coaching, that it instead established a consistent pattern of avoidance and choice by the child, observed across settings and time, and the sentence landed without emphasis, its power coming from restraint. The gallery was silent, not the charged silence of surprise, but the quiet that follows clarity, and my ex stared forward, his expression fixed, while his attorney wrote quickly, the pen scratching hard enough to be audible. The judge then addressed the protective order itself, noting that it had been shaped by assumptions now undermined, and said he was prepared to reconsider its terms in light of the record. The phrase reconsider landed with a soft finality that made my stomach tighten, not with fear, but with anticipation of consequence. He did not announce a decision yet. Instead, he outlined what would be reviewed, what factors would guide the adjustment, and set a brief continuation for final orders. The date spoken aloud and entered by the clerk, the keyboard clicks marking time. As he spoke, my son leaned closer, his shoulder touching my arm, and I did not move away, the contact visible and unremarked. And when the judge finished, he looked once more at counsel and said he expected professionalism, restraint, and adherence to the record going forward, his gaze lingering a fraction longer on my ex's attorney before moving on. When the clerk called for a short recess before the next matter, the room shifted, people standing, whispering, but the tone remained subdued, and my attorney leaned toward me just enough to say, "This is the pivot," her voice low, and I nodded without replying, my eyes on the bench where the judge had set his pen down again, the repetition not lost on me. As we gathered our things, my ex remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, then stood abruptly, his chair scraping sharply against the floor, the sound drawing brief attention before fading, and he walked out with his attorney, their heads close together, voices too low to hear. My son picked up his backpack and waited for me, his posture relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in weeks, and as we moved toward the aisle, the evaluator met my gaze briefly and nodded once, a professional acknowledgement without warmth or judgment, and the supervisor did the same from her seat, witnesses to something now complete. Outside the courtroom, the hallway buzzed softly, the normal churn of cases resuming, but the words reconsider and record echoed in my head as we walked, and I understood that the power had shifted not because anyone argued harder, but because the accumulation had forced a response. And as we stepped into the light near the exit, the date for the final orders already circled in my planner, I knew the next time we returned would not be about what had happened, but about what would change because of it. The final hearing arrived without ceremony, a date circled for weeks now simply becoming today, and when we entered the courtroom the clerk was already seated, the judge's bench cleared of extra folders, only the legal pad and pen in their familiar places, a visual signal that decisions, not arguments, were expected. The room filled steadily, not crowded but attentive, the same evaluator present, the supervisor there again, and a few observers who seemed to recognize us now, their glances brief and contained. And my son stood beside me, as he had each time, his backpack resting against his calf, his hand hovering near the back of my chair before settling there, the motion now so consistent it barely registered. When the clerk called the case and we rose, the chairs scraped in unison, and the judge took a moment before speaking, scanning the room, his eyes landing on counsel and then on the witnesses, and when he began, his voice was calm, almost conversational, as he stated he would be issuing findings and orders based on the consolidated record. He did not invite argument. He did not ask for clarification. He simply proceeded, summarizing the procedural history in plain terms, the allegation raised, the evaluation ordered, the observations made, the evidence entered, and as he spoke, the story unfolded again, but this time without dispute, the facts spoken as settled ground. My ex's attorney sat very still, his hands folded, his gaze fixed forward, and my ex mirrored him, shoulders squared, jaw tight, the posture of someone bracing for impact without flinching. The judge addressed the coaching allegation directly, stating that it had been made publicly and repeatedly, that it carried serious implications, and that after thorough review it was not supported by the evidence, his words precise, deliberate, and then he went further, noting that the persistence of the claim, despite contrary documentation, had contributed to unnecessary strain on the child, and that this would be considered in his orders, and a murmur moved through the gallery before the bailiff's raised hand stilled it. My ex's attorney shifted then, a small movement, his pen rolling off the table and clattering softly to the floor, the sound sharp in the quiet, and he bent to retrieve it, his face flushing briefly before he straightened again, and the judge paused just long enough for the moment to settle before continuing. He described the child's behavior as consistent and self-directed, emphasizing that the court recognized children communicate through actions as often as words, and that ignoring those actions in favor of convenient narratives undermines the court's responsibility. And as he spoke, my son's hand tightened briefly on the chair back and then relaxed, the contact grounding both of us. The judge then turned to the protective order, stating that its current terms were based on assumptions now disproven, and that maintaining them unchanged would not serve the child's best interests, and he outlined the modifications allowed, supervised exchanges adjusted, conditions clarified, requirements imposed on communication and conduct, each item spoken clearly and entered by the clerk, the keyboard clicks marking permanence. When he addressed my ex directly, using his name, the room leaned in without moving, and he said that future conduct would be measured against the record established here, that further unfounded allegations would be viewed as disruptive rather than protective, and that the court expected compliance without manipulation, and my ex nodded once, the movement stiff, his eyes still forward, the public correction complete without theatrics. My ex's attorney requested clarification on one point, his voice measured, and the judge answered succinctly, reiterating the order, leaving no room for misinterpretation, and the attorney nodded and sat back, the exchange brief and definitive. As the judge concluded, he reminded both parties that the court's role was not to assign moral victories, but to ensure stability and safety, and that today's orders reflected that mandate, and he set down his pen, the sound final, and directed the clerk to provide copies of the orders before adjournment. The gavel did not strike. It wasn't needed. The clerk announced the adjournment. Chairs scraped. People stood, but the movement was subdued, the weight of what had been said lingering in the air. And my attorney leaned toward me and whispered that it was done, that the orders were clear, and I nodded, my throat tight but my posture steady, resisting any outward reaction that might draw attention. My son stood close, his backpack already slung over his shoulder, and when we turned toward the aisle, I felt eyes on us, not curious now but acknowledging, witnesses to a quiet reckoning that had unfolded without raised voices. My ex remained seated for a moment longer, his attorney speaking to him in low tones, and when he stood his chair scraped again, louder this time, the sound cutting through the murmur, and several heads turned before looking away, the discomfort, brief and unmistakable. As we walked out, the evaluator caught my eye and nodded once more, her expression neutral but resolved, and the supervisor did the same, their roles complete. And in the hallway, my son exhaled audibly for the first time all morning, the sound small but releasing, and he adjusted his backpack strap and asked if we were done, and I said yes. that we were, and he nodded and started toward the exit without waiting. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different, lighter but not celebratory, and as we descended the steps together, the public correction echoing behind us in words that would live in the record long after the room emptied, I understood that humiliation doesn't always look like raised voices or dramatic gestures. Sometimes it looks like a calm recital of facts that strips away a story someone insisted on telling, leaving only what actually happened for everyone to see. The aftermath did not arrive with relief so much as quiet rearrangement, the kind that happens when a room is returned to after furniture has been moved while you were gone. And the first sign was the envelope from the clerk waiting in our mailbox, thick with copies, my name typed cleanly on the front, and I carried it inside without opening it, setting it on the counter beside the keys where important things tended to land before being handled. My son dropped his backpack by the door and kicked off his shoes, the familiar thud grounding, and asked what was for dinner, the question ordinary and necessary, and I answered without thinking, the rhythm of our lives resuming even as the record sat unopened. When I finally slit the envelope open with a letter opener, the paper slid free easily, the orders laid out in formal language, modifications listed, conditions clarified, dates fixed, and I read them slowly, not searching for surprises, but for confirmation that what had been said aloud now existed on paper. And when I finished, I stacked the pages neatly and placed them in the folder that had grown thick over weeks, the final edition making it complete. Over the next days, the changes took shape in practical ways. A revised exchange schedule emailed from the supervisor, the tone, professional and precise, new parameters stated plainly, and I replied with acknowledgement only, no commentary, letting the system absorb the update without friction. At school pickup, the counselor smiled and said the paperwork had come through, that adjustments would be made quietly, and my son stood beside me listening, his posture relaxed, his hands no longer busy with zippers or straps. And when we walked back to the car, he skipped a step on the curb, just because he could, the movement small and unremarked. At work, my manager closed the door to my office and said she was glad things seemed to be settling, that she appreciated my consistency during a hard period, and I thanked her and returned to my desk, the projects waiting where I'd left them, the hum of normal responsibility familiar again. The supervised exchanges shifted as ordered. Fewer observers, clearer boundaries, the room at the community center feeling less like a test site and more like a checkpoint, and my ex followed the new rules closely, his words minimal, his movements careful, the corrections still fresh enough to shape behavior, and my son navigated the transitions with less visible tension, his choices steady, the pattern no longer contested. One afternoon, weeks later, as we walked past the courthouse on our way to the library, my son slowed and looked up at the building, the stone facade catching the light, and he asked if we would have to go back there, his voice neutral, and I said not unless something changed. And he nodded and kept walking, the answer sufficient. At home, the fridge magnet came down as schedules stabilized, papers filed away, the kitchen clearing of notices and reminders until only the calendar remained, and I noticed how much quieter the space felt without the constant visual pressure of what needed to be proved. The neighbor waved from across the driveway one evening and asked how we were, and I said we were good, which was true enough now, and she smiled and went back inside, the interaction brief and uncomplicated. On a Sunday morning, my son sat at the table drawing while I drank coffee, the steam curling up, and he slid a picture toward me without a word. A simple sketch of two figures walking side by side, backpacks on, the lines confident, and I nodded and set it on the counter where it would stay for a while before being moved somewhere safer. The consequences continued quietly, a follow-up letter noting compliance, a checklist completed, the system closing its loops, and each closure made more room for ordinary things, homework questions, weekend plans, arguments about bedtime, the normal negotiations of a household finding its balance again. I did not think often about the courtroom after that, not because it hadn't mattered, but because its work was done, the record holding what needed to be held, so we didn't have to carry it every day, and when memories surfaced, they were less sharp, more like markers along a road we had already passed. One evening, as I locked the front door and turned off the lights, my son paused in the hallway and leaned briefly against my side, a quick contact, unspoken, and then went to his room, the door closing with that careful click that had once felt heavy and now felt simply habitual. I stood there a moment longer, listening to the house settle, aware that justice does not always announce itself. Sometimes it just rearranges the rules so that quiet can return. And as I set the alarm for the next day and placed the keys back in their spot, I understood that what lingered was not the humiliation of anyone else, but the steadiness we had regained, the simple ability to move through our days without having to prove where we belonged, a consequence that did not need witnesses to feel complete.